You think you know the Vikings, longships cutting through fog, warriors with axes, raids on monasteries, but nobody talks about the other cargo they brought home, the human one, the system that made 10% of their population property. The markets where a woman cost 3 silver marks and children were separated from mothers on wooden platforms. The law that said if you stole bread to feed your family, you became someone's slave for life, your body, your children, your children's children. What happens when we dig up the graves and find the truth? When the skeletons tell stories the sagas left out? If you value documented Viking Age history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Neil Price's 2020 Children of Ash and Elm, published by Basic Books, and Ben Raffield's 2019 peer-reviewed study, The Slave Markets of the Viking World, in the journal Slavery and Abolition, Volume 40. Issue 4. These aren't pop history books. Price is Distinguished Professor of Archaeology at Uppsala University with 35 years researching Vikings. Raffield's work appears in early medieval Europe and uses comparative archaeology across slave trading societies. Now back to the information. 821. Atar, near Dublin. The Annals of Ulster record it cold. The heathens plundered Atar, and they carried off a great number of women into captivity. Not gold, not silver, women. This wasn't unusual. By 922, when Ahmad ibn Fadlan met Norse traders on the Volga River, he watched slave girls being sold while their owners sexually abused them in front of buyers. He wrote it down. We have his account. 977. The Arab geographer Ibn Hawqal described a Viking slave trade stretching from Spain to Egypt across the Mediterranean. These aren't legends. These are eyewitness reports from 3 different continents spanning 156 years. The word slave itself comes from Slavic because Vikings raided Eastern European peoples so systematically that their ethnic name became the term for human property. Let that sink in. An entire people raided so often that their name means owned person in multiple languages. 10% of Viking Age Scandinavia was enslaved. Some estimates go as high as 25%, 2 to 3 thralls per household. In some wealthy estates, 30. These weren't prisoners of war waiting for ransom. These were permanent property, called thralls in Old Norse. The word means one who runs, but they couldn't run. They were bought, sold, bred, worked, beaten, and killed with impunity. Or here's the twist that hits different. You committed a crime at home in Scandinavia. Theft. The worst crime in Viking society because it meant you were dishonest. You stole bread, you stole cloth, you became property. And if you were a woman convicted of theft, the law was specific. You didn't just lose your freedom. You became the thrall of your victim. The person you wronged now owned you, your body, your labor, everything. The records on Viking Age slavery show women convicted of theft were forced to become thralls to their victims. No trial by combat, no paying a fine. You were property. And being property meant something very specific in Viking society. Norwegian legal language referred to thralls and female thralls using the neuter gender. Not masculine, not feminine. Neuter. The grammatical gender for objects. For things. Free people got masculine or feminine. Thralls got the same grammar as a hammer, a ship, a cooking pot. The Codex Holmiensis from 1241, 2 centuries after the Viking Age officially ended, still contained rules for managing slaves. Slavery was supposedly abolished in Sweden in 1335, but the law codes kept the rules because some regions held onto the practice. The fact that they had to keep banning it tells you how deeply embedded it was. Anna Kjellström, researcher at Stockholm University's Osteological Research Laboratory, examined skeletal remains of presumed thralls from graves in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Published findings show signs of abuse and decapitation. Some thralls lived alongside their masters, bones showing similar nutrition and wear patterns. But the decapitations tell a different story. These people were killed and buried with their owners, sacrificed. A great man died. A slave girl volunteered to join him in death. Or maybe volunteered is the wrong word when you're property. They dressed her in fine clothes. They gave her alcohol. They passed her through a tent where 6 men raped her. Then 2 men strangled her, while an old woman called the Angel of Death stabbed her in the heart. They placed her body with her master in a ship and burned everything. The high-status burial included decapitated individuals presumed to be thralls. Similar patterns appear across Scandinavia. Graves with one wealthy person and multiple bodies showing trauma. Decapitation, no grave goods. These weren't honored dead. These were people who had to follow their masters into death. If a thrall and a free person committed theft together, only the free person was charged. The thrall had no agency, no legal personhood. The crime belonged to the master because the thrall belonged to the master. No compensation to the thrall's family because thralls didn't have families in the legal sense. The only payment was to the master for lost property, like killing someone's cow. You paid the owner. The Græðis laws from Iceland, written down around 1117 to 1118 but preserving earlier oral tradition, set compensation based on the thrall's value as a worker. Age, strength, skills. A craftsman thrall worth more than a field thrall. The Herning rune stone in Jutland, Denmark, tells a rare story. Toki Smith raised the stone in memory of Thorgisl Gudmunder's son, who gave him gold and freedom. Toki was a blacksmith, skilled, valuable, and Thorgisl freed him, but freed didn't mean equal. A freed thrall was called a leysingi. They existed in ambiguous space between slavery and liberty. They remained obligated to their former owners for generations. They had lower legal rights, lower compensation in court. It took 2 or 3 generations for descendants of freed thralls to gain full rights of the freeborn. Even freedom came with chains. Their sons' names: Noisy, Bireboy, Stout, Sticky, Bedmate, Bad Breath, Stumpy, Fatty, Sluggish, Grizzled, Stupor, Longlegs. Their daughters: Stumpina, Dumpy, Bulging Calves, Bellows Nose, Shouty, Bondwoman, Great Gossip, Raggedy Hips, Craneshanks. Not names, insults. Several imply illness, poor hygiene, and sexual servitude. Not one acknowledges individual identity or personality. The poem describes their work: carrying heavy bundles, plaiting materials, fixing fences, dunging fields, working pigs, watching goats, digging peat. Their bodies marked by labor. Wrinkled skin burnt by sun, scabbed nails, gnarled knuckles, dull eyes, bare feet covered in soil. Ibn Fadlan described it directly. Thrall women were concubines. The Græðis laws permitted a man to purchase a female thrall specifically for sexual pleasure. Not marriage. Pleasure, a purchase category. Female thralls couldn't refuse. Their bodies were property. Masters could beat them, rape them, share them, sell them, all legal. This genetic signature tells the story the sagas sanitize. Norsemen took women from raids and brought them to Iceland as concubines and thralls. Many of these women were likely forced. The genetic imbalance during early settlement suggests polygyny among elites and sexual slavery among the broader population. This created a shortage of available women for poorer men. So they raided, they took captives, they brought back women who couldn't refuse. The sagas sometimes frame this as taking wives, but the Annals of Ulster calls it what it was: carrying off women into captivity. Hedeby in Denmark, Burka in Sweden. These weren't just trading posts, they were slave markets. Archaeologists found iron collars and shackles at all 3 sites. The placement matters. Near harbors, in urban centers, not rural farms. These restraints weren't for animals, they were for people. The collars match restraints used on humans throughout history. Similar patterns, similar measurements, similar wear. One woman sang psalms to identify herself as a nun. Rimbert exchanged his horse for her freedom. One woman, one horse. That was her price. And Rimbert was wealthy. Most captives didn't have anyone who could afford to buy them. Vikings trafficked slaves along multiple routes: west to Dublin, then to Moorish Spain, or back to Scandinavia, east via Ladoga and Novgorod, down the Volga or Dnieper rivers, to the Byzantine Empire or the Abbasid Caliphate in the Islamic world. Arab Durham's silver hoards found in Sweden and Denmark prove this trade. The Spillings hoard, the Sundveda hoard, coins from Baghdad and beyond, thousands of silver pieces, payment for human cargo. Vikings called Rus traded European captives to Muslim merchants. The Muslims wanted Christian and pagan slaves because Islamic law restricted enslaving other Muslims. The Vikings had a steady supply. Slavic peoples, Baltic peoples, Franks, Anglo-Saxons, Celts, all moved east for silver. One estimate says this trade functioned from at least 786 until 1009, over 200 years of continuous human trafficking across continents. One estimate suggests a single 90 square meter sail for a Viking ship could take one person up to 5 years to produce. Each ship needed 2 sails. There were hundreds of ships. Neil Price argues slave labor was necessary to maintain the Norse fleet. Without thralls producing sails, the Viking expansion couldn't have happened. The raids that made Vikings famous depended on the labor of people they'd enslaved in previous raids. A cycle. At a site near Stockholm, near modern IKEA's location, archaeologists found a small round hut dug into the ground on a slope above a large manor house. The hut appears to be living quarters for slaves during the height of Viking prosperity. Charlotte Hedenstierna Johnson of Stockholm University notes the layout. Another Swedish site, Sanda, shows a large house surrounded by much smaller structures, possible slave quarters. Neil Price calls it plantation-like. Big house, small dwellings for the labor force. The parallel to later American slavery isn't accidental. Economic systems built on unfree labor developed similar patterns. If a male thrall refused to work, the thing, the legal assembly, could authorize the master to maim or kill him. The Grey Goose laws from Iceland, dating to the Commonwealth period, detail one punishment for a thrall who killed his master and fled. They cut off all 4 limbs, arms, legs. Then let him live, crawling everywhere for the rest of his life as a living warning to other thralls. Don't kill your master. Look what happens. A woman committing adultery would lose her nose and ears. Men were merely reprimanded. The law died with Knut, but it shows how gendered punishment could be. Women's bodies marked permanently for sexual transgression. If a thrall stole at their master's command, the master was punished, not the thrall. The thrall had no agency. The crime belonged to the owner. But if a thrall stole independently, the punishment was severe: beating, maiming, death. The Bjarki laws from Sweden, possibly dating to 832, prescribed tarring and feathering for theft during trading missions. The thief's head was shaved, covered in tar, then duck feathers thrown on top. Then he ran a gauntlet between 2 lines of traders who threw stones and bricks. If he survived, no further punishment. If he died, the crime was settled. Some historians estimate many thralls in Scandinavia were actually local-born, not raid captives. Tor Iverson's doctoral study of Norwegian slaves in the Middle Ages concludes many were recruited from within the country, born into it, punished into it, debt into it. The debt slavery mechanism was called flatforing. If you couldn't pay, you could voluntarily become a thrall to settle it. Voluntary is a strange word when the alternative is destitution and death, but Viking law considered it a choice. You remained a thrall until the debt was paid. Sometimes that meant years, sometimes it meant forever, because interest and additional debts could accumulate. If she was poor and her husband or son was captured and held for ransom, she had to raise the money. And if she couldn't, if she stole to try to buy them back, she became property. The law didn't care about motivation. Theft was theft. Dishonesty was the worst crime. You hid your actions. You couldn't be trusted, so you lost everything. And when your family is captive and you have no resources, desperation follows. The law didn't bend for desperation. Erik Persson Ångerman, a young Swedish sailor, was enslaved in Algiers after Barbary corsairs captured his ship, the Wibbes, from Stockholm on May 10th. He sent a letter to his wife, Maria Olsdotter, via a freed colleague. He wrote, "He sat in hard slavery in Algiers." Maria had no funds to buy his freedom. She appealed to the king through the governor of Gävle for money to be gathered in churches to purchase her enslaved husband. Her application was approved. Many poor women are documented doing the same in this period. This was 1700 years after the Viking Age ended, but the pattern of wives desperately trying to free captured husbands spans centuries. Viking Age sources are thinner, but the economic and legal pressures were the same. Archbishop Rimbert buying the nun in Hedeby wasn't unique. Christian authorities increasingly opposed Christians enslaving other Christians. It was one reason Viking slave trade shifted heavily toward pagan populations. Easier to justify, easier to maintain. By the 11th century, as Scandinavia Christianized, internal slavery began declining. Not because Vikings suddenly became moral, because the economic and religious justification shifted. Iceland's Grey Goose laws allowed slavery, but the law text Kristina Laga Thatur from 1122 to 1133 is the last mention of existing slaves in Iceland. By the late 12th century, no existing slaves are mentioned. In Norway, slavery phased out from the late 12th century onward. The Magnus Lagabøte's Landslov of 1274 no longer recognized slavery. The reason was economic. Big landowners found it more profitable to rent land to free farmers than to work it with thralls. Christian rhetoric against enslaving Christians made it harder to acquire new slaves in an almost totally Christian Europe. The supply dried up. In Sweden, slavery was banned county by county during the 13th century. The last remaining county abolished it in 1335. In Denmark, slavery phased out during the 12th century. The will of Bishop Absalon from 1201 mentions freeing a couple of his existing slaves. A letter between the Pope and Anders Sunesson mentions Sunesson's slaves. After the early 13th century, slaves are no longer mentioned. The law text, Giskilov from 1241, doesn't mention slavery existing in Denmark. Where children were born into chains, where women could be enslaved for stealing bread, where men could be decapitated and buried with their masters, where sexual exploitation was legal, where beating a thrall to death brought no punishment except reimbursing the owner. They give thralls joke names and barely mention them. The law codes, written down centuries later by Christian monks, preserve the rules but distance the violence. Even modern Viking reenactors focus on warriors, not the labor system that made the warriors possible. But the archaeology doesn't lie. The skeletons don't lie, the iron collars don't lie, the The silver hordes from Islamic lands don't lie. The genetic signature in Iceland doesn't lie. No Hollywood gloss. Comment where you're watching from. Now for the final reveal. The human bodies were left in the ruins, not retrieved for burial, mixed with animal remains. This predates the Vikings by 700 years. Slavery in Scandinavia wasn't a Viking invention. It was inheritance. It was tradition stretching back into prehistory. The Vikings industrialized it. They systematized it. They built trade routes across 3 continents to monetize it. But the foundation was already there, built over generations, normalized over centuries. Their children remained marked. Their grandchildren finally achieved full rights. 3 generations to wash away the stain of having been property. The system created hereditary underclasses that lasted long after the chains came off. That's the reveal the graves give us. That's the truth the silver hordes confirm. Their voices mostly silent, but their bodies tell the story, and it's worse than the sagas ever admitted. She is an Irish princess, captured and sold to an Icelandic chieftain. She is mute. She refuses to speak. For years, she says nothing. She is property. She is a concubine. She gives birth to a son by her master. One day, her master overhears her speaking to that son, speaking perfect Irish. Her silence was not inability. It was a weapon. It was the only resistance she had. It was her refusal to participate. It was her no. We spoke of the Rigstula, the poem that gave thralls names like Noisy and Stumpy and Bad Breath. This was theology. This was divine justification. It said you were born to this. This brings us to the most vulnerable, the children. The child of a thrall mother was a thrall, partus sequitur ventrum. The offspring follows the womb. It didn't matter who the father was, and the father was, so often, the master. They will inherit his land, his ships, his reputation. In the same longhouse, living with the livestock, is a female thrall. He bought her in Hedeby. She was captured in Ireland. He uses her body as the law permits. She becomes pregnant. She gives birth to his child. That child is the half-sibling of the free heirs. That child has the master's DNA, perhaps his very features. But that child is property. That child can be sold. That child can be beaten. That child can be killed by its own father with no legal penalty. This wasn't an accident. This was a feature. This was how you bred a new generation of slaves. The supply from raids was inconsistent. The supply from birth was forever. In slave societies across the world, from Rome to the antebellum South, there is a dark shadow, infanticide. A mother, knowing her child is born only to suffer, to be property, to be used as she was used, makes a terrible choice. She takes the child's life, to spare it. We have no direct text saying that the thrall woman smothered her infant, but the law codes give us a clue. The Norwegian Frostatings and Gulating Laws had specific prohibitions against exposing infants, leaving them in the wilderness to die. This was a pre-Christian practice, often used for children with deformities. But why did the laws need to be so specific? Why did they carry over so strongly into the Christian era? It is not a leap to imagine a thrall mother with no rights and no hope making this desperate calculation. A final, horrific act of mercy. That they were, as the law code said, the neuter gender, an it. You stole cloth, you were caught, you are now the property of the person you wronged. She lives in your longhouse, she does your bidding. The humiliation was total, it was a social death. You signed yourself over, you became property. Maybe, the law said, you could buy your way out. But how? How could property, which cannot own property, earn the money to buy itself? It was a trap, a one-way street into hereditary slavery. This internal slavery, the enslavement of other Norse, served a vital purpose. It wasn't just punishment, it was a threat. It was the ultimate tool of social control. It kept the free poor, the carls, in line. Do not steal, do not fail, do not defy your betters, or you will join the livestock. You will become an it. The fear of falling into thraldom was perhaps as powerful as the institution itself. But scholars have debated this. A more chilling etymology links it to thra, meaning strife or stubbornness, one who is stubborn, one who resists. The Gragas, the Icelandic law codes, are obsessed with what to do with runaway thralls. The laws wouldn't be so specific, so detailed, if it wasn't a common problem. If you were caught within a certain distance of your master's farm, you were brought back and beaten. But if you made it further, if you got away, you were not free. You became something else. You became an outlaw, a skoggermatter, a forest man. All protection. You had no rights. None. Any free man could kill you on sight for a reward. Your master could hunt you down. Your life was worth nothing. You lived in the caves, the forests, the margins, stealing to survive. Hunted like an animal. Part 1 mentioned the thrall who killed his master. All 4 limbs cut off, left to live as a torso, a living warning. This was the terror that kept the system in place. The penalty for running was so horrific, so absolute, that most would not dare. They ran to other farms, hoping for a kinder master, only to be turned in. They ran to the ports, trying to stow away on ships, only to be caught by the port reeve. They ran to the mountains, to the deep woods, choosing the forest man's life over the thralls. A slave uprising? We have no record of a Spartacus moment in Viking Scandinavia. The reasons are brutal and practical. 1. Language. A wealthy master owned thralls from Ireland, from Estonia, from the Slavic lands, from England. They didn't speak the same language, they couldn't coordinate. They couldn't organize. This was a deliberate tactic. 2. Weapons. Thralls were forbidden from owning weapons. A thrall with an axe was a threat. The sagas are full of stories of thralls who are given a weapon and immediately use it to kill their masters and run. It was too much of a risk. 3. Isolation. They were scattered. 2 to 3 per household, maybe 30 on a massive estate. They were never in large enough numbers in one place to overwhelm the free population who were armed to the teeth. It was breaking a tool, accidentally. It was working just slow enough to not be beaten. It was misplacing the master's things. It was setting a fire that coincidentally burned the master's storehouse. It was whispering your own stories, in your own language, to your children in the dark. It was every tiny act of humanity in a system designed to crush it. From Ireland and Scotland, the sagas call them wives. The Annals of Ulster called it carrying off women into captivity. Iceland was not founded by families, it was founded by Norsemen and the women they enslaved. The entire society was built, from day one, on a bedrock of thraldom and sexual exploitation. Compiled in 1086, just 2 decades after the Norman conquest, it was a massive survey of all of England, and it recorded slaves, servi. The highest percentages of enslaved people in all of England were in the Danish areas, the regions the Vikings had ruled for 200 years. They had imprinted their slave society onto Anglo-Saxon England. But in Scandinavia, it did die. How? How does a 400-year-old institution, the very engine of the economy, just stop? The raids slowed to a trickle. The great voyages down the Volga to Baghdad, the trade routes that exchanged northern people for southern silver, they shut down. The supply of foreign captives dried up. Agriculture was becoming more difficult. The old system of a prestige economy, where your wealth was measured in ships, silver, and the number of thralls you owned, was becoming inefficient. And if they get sick and die, you lose your investment. You're a free man. You rent your farm from the local jarl or, increasingly, from the bishop. You give him a huge portion of your crops. You are tied to that land. You can't leave. You are still unfree, but the risk is now on you. If your crops fail, you starve, not the landowner. He just finds a new tenant. Bishops owned slaves. Monasteries owned slaves. The letter from the Pope to Anders Sunesson in Denmark in the early 13th century mentions his slaves. As Scandinavia converted, the old justification for enslaving your Norse neighbor for theft or debt began to crumble. How can you, a good Christian, own another good Christian? But more importantly, it destroyed the external supply. The Vikings' traditional raiding grounds, England, Ireland, the Slavic lands, were all Christian now. You couldn't just sail to Ireland and fill your ship with captives anymore. It was a sin. The church didn't want power held by jarls who owned people. The church wanted power held by land, which the church itself could own. By shifting the system from personal thraldom to land-based serfdom, the church became the biggest landowner and the most powerful force in all of Scandinavia. So the system starved. The supply of new thralls ended. The economic model became obsolete. The religious justification evaporated. In Norway, the national law of 1274 simply doesn't recognize slavery anymore. In Sweden, it was banned region by region, with the last holdout county abolishing it in 1335. In Denmark, it fades from the records by the early 1300s. But not gone. The stain remained. Remember the Læsingi, the freed thrall. When Talkie Smith was given his freedom on that rune stone, he wasn't made equal. He was a Læsingi. His legal rights were lower, the compensation for his murder was less. He still owed obligations to his former master. And so did his children, and so did his grandchildren. The shadow of the thrall system lasted for another 100 years after the last thrall was freed. It created a permanent underclass. It cemented the power of the landowning elite. It built the foundation of the medieval kingdoms. But the system they were built to feed, the system of human trafficking, didn't just vanish. It echoes. It echoes in the DNA of modern Icelanders. It echoes in the etymology of the word slave. And it echoes in the deep, unbreachable class structures that defined Scandinavia for the next 1,000 years. And the wealth that funded the entire Viking Age, the silver that glittered in the hoards, the power that built the kingdoms, was bought with human bodies. This is the history the sagas left out. The story of the 10%, the story of the owned. And the details are darker than anyone ever told you.